Connecting rod here is much looser, even though the nut here I've loosened, it's much looser than it should be, which kind of tells me that this bolt is probably the wrong size. I can tell it has been replaced because this is not the type of bolt that belongs in here. What's supposed to be on either side of this is a lock washer with knurled edges, and also this nut is supposed to be long enough that it's double nutted, similar to the saw over here that I have on the other side of the bench. Okay, over here in this shot, we have a saw that's properly assembled with the proper hardware in it. As we zoom in, you can see the double nuts and the washers. That's what we're going to wind up with when we put this assembly in front of me back together again. Okay, we will begin by getting rid of this bad hardware on here. Yeah, I can tell there's Allen head socket screw there and a piece of stainless steel screw. So this does not belong here. So somebody tried to effect a repair that introduced a new problem. So we will take this out, and I've taken the liberty of putting a new screw out here to show you how that is supposed to fit. So here's how this part is supposed to fit. This is a sleeved screw, and you can see that one is much tighter. So let's lubricate this bearing. Pick a little bit of this grease and lubricate this bearing. By the way, this particular bearing contains the most load of any of the bearings in the assembly, because it's the one that's moving this vertical rocker, both these linkages, and the entire rocker assembly is at the front. So all of the stress of moving those parts goes through this one bearing. So it's pretty important that it be properly lubricated. And it would help if I put the sleeve back in there first. Okay, if this is the first time that you've taken your saw apart, it would be a good idea at this point, when you go to reassemble it, to just remove the rough edges from this casting. With just a couple of strokes of a file. That will enable you to get this sleeve back in there without too awful much stress. Okay, after we coax that connecting rod in there, now if you take a punch and move it around to line that up, you should now be able to put the proper screw in there, along with the washers that belong. And the proper nuts. Okay, the knurled portion of the washer is supposed to go against the casting on each side. So I've got the knurled part of the washer up. Insert it through the back. Okay, because of the fact that that sleeve is wider than the bearing, that's a message that says that the sleeve is trapped in between these two halves of this casting, and therefore it's okay to tighten that thing down as much as you want. So what we'll do now is tighten up this front face. And then add the double nut on there to prevent the unit from backing apart. I want to tighten this. I want to make sure that the nut that is already in place is not moving. Okay. So just jam one against the other. If you want to get a really good fit, you'll double wrench it, but I don't have a wrench on hand that is thin enough to be able to grab that inside nut. So once the unit is back together like this again, you should have a really tight fit there. As you can see here, I can feel barely more than a bump when I try to move it. Okay, now then, one of the next things to examine while you're here is the sleeve that normally goes in here. This is not the sleeve that came out of here, but I wanted to show you this as a good example of a bad example. If you take a sleeve out of there that has those shiny flats on there like that, that is a bad sign. That means that the lubrication has failed, the bearing has quit turning, the sleeve has quit turning, and the needle bearings are sitting there just banging in the same spot against the hardened sleeve, and it's creating flat spots. That will cause a lot of bumping noise when the machine operates. So every time this vertical rocker assembly moves, the remainder of the needle bearings are rolling over those spots, and every time it goes over there it creates a bump. If your sleeve looks like that when you take it apart, you probably need to replace everything related to it, which would be the bearings themselves, and put a new sleeve in there. So here's an example of a good sleeve. It has no shiny spots, no bumps or dimples or any of that. When we go to put it back together, we'll use that one. All right, in the meantime, now it looks like this particular bearing in here needs lubrication. So we'll get some Okay, so as to keep from having too many loose parts at once, we'll disassemble parts of it, lubricate it as needed, and then put it back together before moving on. Now that I've got this thing lined up, we'll insert the proper bolt through from the underside. Keep in mind that all this hardware, the nuts are supposed to be aimed out. That's because of the clearance issues on the side of the case. Okay, and testing the tolerance on that feels really, really good. So now we will move on to the balance of it. Okay, now what we'll do is we'll move on to this assembly here. I want to take this apart to make sure that this bearing in here is properly lubricated and the sleeve looks to be in good condition. To facilitate doing that, I'm going to extend this out so that I can get to everything. Okay, one of the things that I want to point out to you at this point is, as I take this linkage off of here, behind there are thrust washers. And I can't stress enough how important these things are. A lot of people will forget to put them back. They have a great deal of difficulty in getting them back in place, but I'll show you some techniques that'll help you with that. Based on the lubrication that I'm seeing here, I expect that this has been lubricated and it's still in good shape. So wipe the excess lubrication off of here and examine this sleeve for wear. Okay, here you can see it's got some shiny spots on it, which just indicate normal wear. I don't see any facets as though the needle bearing was pressing against the sleeve, so we'll go ahead and reuse that. The needle bearings inside here appear to be in very good shape and well lubricated. I'll just do a touch up on that to facilitate keeping everything together while I reassemble it. Okay, I've got a dab of grease on the inside there that will keep the sleeve in place while I reassemble it. Okay, the important part is to put a dab of grease on each face of this casting, such that when you put the thrust washer on there, that the grease, the heavy weight of the grease will keep the thrust washer in place for the rest of the reassembly. And then when you get done assembling it, wipe the excess off. Okay, at that point, this is ready for reassembly now. There's enough grease on there that it keep everything in place while you reassemble it. Okay, now that I have the parts back together again, you want to clean up the excess grease and make sure that those thrust washers remained where they were supposed to be. Okay, I can see here that that one appears to be riding in the groove that it's supposed to be in. And the one on this side is likewise. Yep. It's still in place and trapped on either side. As I try to move this back and forth, it appears to be quite snug. Okay, so at this point, do a little bit of cleanup and move on. Okay, now what we're going to do is, before we attack this upper rocker assembly here, we're going to do that with the arm mounted on the machine. So we can go ahead and put the rest of this back together. Okay, there we've got the rest of this back together again, and we'll begin putting it back the way it was when we first took the side cover off. So what I'm going to do is reattach this and reattach these so that I can then show you how to put that nut back on the motor. We'll get a few parts out here. Okay, now we've got enough of the machine back together that it'll stay that way. We're going to reverse the process here on that retaining nut on the end of the motor. So we begin by putting the vice grips on the counterweight. Remember, I warned you about the nut on this thing is left-hand thread. So you want to reverse your thinking when you go to put that back on there. Otherwise, if you damage the shaft on that motor, it's an expensive repair. Okay, now we have that nut back on the end of the motor. There's one additional thing that I want to do while I think of it, and that is this wavy washer that goes onto the end of the shaft. It's a very easy thing to forget, so we will go ahead and put that thing on the end of here as well. Okay, now that we've got it partially back together again, we can now address this part of the machine. To get this thing fully separated, what I want to do first is remove this linkage, remove the hardware from that, so that we can get this whole assembly off of here. Okay. for the time being, I'm going to put the related hardware down here. When I told you about the thrust washers down here on this rocker assembly, you've got the same situation up here. So just want to make sure that those thrust washers don't come loose and roll around to some inaccessible location on the shop floor. Before we can free this up, I just remembered one other piece of linkage that's in here. There is a shaft that goes all the way from the front to the rear that controls the blade tension. And what it does is as you turn this, it drives an eccentric that causes this wedge to pull forward against this plate. That whole process there raises the arm, the upper arm, to put tension on the blade that would be out here. So what we got to do is we got to free up this tensioner mechanism. That requires a metric Allen. Okay, the screw in here is frequently held in place with Loctite. I'm pulling this whole assembly out so you can see it. You'll see there's some dried Loctite on the threads of this screw. So before you reassemble it, you'll have to clean that up. Here is the eccentric path here, where there's yet another sleeve that rides on top of the shaft, which is the linkage back to that wedge. So now we've got that thing freed up so that when we take the hardware loose here, we can slide this whole assembly out. Okay, so there we have the entire upper rocker assembly. Inside of here is a bellows that you can see is operated by the upper rocker assembly. So when that thing goes up and down, that bellows gets operated. Okay, so we'll push that bearing out and examine all of this for lubrication. We've got this assembly loose from the rest of the machine. We're now going to pop these two screws out of here to free up these rockers. Okay, we now got the hardware loose. We just need to coax these out of the casting. Okay, now the objective was to get these two horizontal rockers out of the top. So we'll press these sleeves out. Okay, as I believe I indicated earlier, we've got some telltale signs here that This one has had a good amount of pounding going on in it, possibly without lubrication. Next thing we're going to do is press this bearing out, put a new one in, and put a new sleeve in. And I can see some telltale signs of powder here. There shouldn't be any powder inside this machine. So we've obviously got some very dry bearings here that have started to fail. Now we're going to go through this assembly and replace all these bearings. This is one large open frame needle bearing, and this boss here on the casting really contains two bearings, one on each side, and then this last casting has a single bearing. The double bearing is a little bit of a different animal, a little bit different to get the bearing out of. So what I do with that, take a punch and go down inside there and catch the top of the bearing that you're pushing out. Just knock that through, you move it out of the way, and you've got the old bearing. Put that over here out of the way so we don't get them mixed up. And the reason we're doing this is because of that one sleeve that we took out that was showing signs of wear. This one here we'll press out. So now what we can do is grab new bearings, and these are a lot easier to put in. And I want to make sure that the stamping that is on the side of the bearing is showing so that the next person that gets into here can see what kind of bearing it is in case they need to change it. Okay, so that presses the bearing in on that side. While we're at it, we'll get the one on the opposite side. Okay, so that one went in there. These other single bearings are easier to get in and out. You just use the new bearing to press the old one out. I'll just checking to make sure, since this is the one that's going to have thrust washers on it, you have to make sure that it's below the surface slightly. And we'll just give it a tap to make sure that it's below the surface. Yep, I'm satisfied with that. Okay, now we go to this last bearing and press it out. That one's not cooperating real well. We'll use a variation off of how to press it out by getting more support under it. And there we've got the whole set of them. There are two more bearings underneath here, but based on how tight this feels, I think they are probably sufficient. The sleeve on this one gave all indications it had seen some pretty good abuse, so we needed to change that one. So now we'll push the arbor press back out of the way and start putting this assembly back together. There is a bellows down inside here that is responsible for the exhaust air that comes out that is used to blow the wood dust and chips away. So we want to be careful that we don't impale that bellows with the counterweight here. Okay, now then, to get these lined up here, all you need to do is put the screws back in. That part there moves freely, and there is virtually no side-to-side motion in there at all. So now we're ready to begin the reassembly process. Remember, the last step here is to attach the linkage. Put a little dab of grease on here to help secure the thrust washers. Get that sufficiently held together that we can reassemble it now. Just putting one of those in there for the moment until I make sure that I got this linkage together along with all the thrust washers. Okay, I stopped part way there so I could make sure that the thrust washer is located where it's supposed to be. looks like it's there. Okay, looks like everything's behaving as it should. Okay, now we're going to make sure and put this sleeve for the tensioner back on in the right spot. Then I'm going to put a dab of grease on that. And if you have available some Loctite or thread sealant of some type, I'd recommend you put it on at this point. Okay, now we're ready to finish putting the saw back together so we can run it. Okay, what we'll do is cut down on the torque considerably for putting these next screws in because we're securing plastic parts now as opposed to metal against metal. Okay, now then, at this point is where we got to reattach the wires from the switch and the controls. For those of you that are intimidated by electrical things, this is really pretty easy. This connector is keyed. There's only one place it'll go. That's where the mate to the key is. So I get a hold of that with a pair of pliers. Line the key and the receiver up and just push it into place. Then you've got two other wires that need to be attached. One goes to the fuse. I give it a little bit of a pull on there to make sure that it's securely attached. Then there should only be one unoccupied post on this variable frequency drive board, that being the one that I'm pointing at with the pliers. You plug the other quick connect onto there, and we should be ready to energize this. Just gonna tuck everything back into place. And the last thing I'm going to do is put a blade in here so we can tension it to make sure that it's going to work properly. Okay, and making sure the speed control is all the way down. So that's a lot quieter than when we started. Most of the rest of the noise that you hear in here is because of the fact that the whole thing is not unitized yet, which will occur when we put the side covers on. Okay, and now we're ready to start reassembling the side covers. The first side cover that goes on is the one back here. All this stuff goes back together in the opposite order. So we start out by removing some of the screws that we temporarily installed to keep things together, because we're not going to run the saw anymore. That nut there is just a convenience item that I use for holding it together to be able to run it. That goes back in my parts box. We now take the screw off that's holding the top arm. So as long as we don't do anything too drastic with that, it'll stay there. And the last screw we have to take out is this one here that's keeping the vertical rocker together. And then usually what I like to do is assemble the whole array of screws here in front of me so that they're easily accessible, so that I can get the unit back together before things start falling. Okay, last thing I'm checking for is to make sure that wavy washer is still where it's supposed to be. It mates up against this surface here on the side cover. Okay, the unit is unplugged in case we make accidental contact with something. Okay, and what I've got to look for at this point is where this piece of sheet metal is. That piece of sheet metal has to go back in this slot here and here. So it's best to get on the back side of the saw like I am. It's pretty easy to see those 2 points. They're lined up now, so the rest of the machine should go back together pretty easily. Just want to make sure that the wires are not pinched on there. We will reinsert the strain relief after we get the whole machine back together. And we'll begin putting a few screws in there to get the unit together. As they draw down, everything should fold together. Okay, these two screws here can't go on until this side cover gets in place. We can't do that until we can safely remove that. So we've got a little bit of assembly left to do yet. Okay, that covers all the hardware for the back cover. Now we'll take that nut off there so we can put the front cover on. I would recommend you leave those screws sticking through there, which keeps the foot in the proper attitude. And just kind of roll that cover on there. Again, I'd recommend putting that as the first nut back on there, because that draws everything back together again. Okay, that saddle back there in the back is the part that holds the back of the table in place. And I bet you thought I lost the last screw there. It's actually hiding back over there where it was retracted. The last two screws that go in secure the casting for the front. Okay, since I've run out of parts, I think I might be done. It does sound much better than the last time. Okay, thank you for watching.